Hey everybody, Eli from Elfbait, and today I wanted to discuss physics and spellcasting. This is a topic that came up in a discussion between myself and another DM, my friend Jason, where he described something that happened in his game recently that led to kind of a moment of misery for one of his players, and for him as a DM. I think anytime you fail to entertain your or satisfy your players, there's a little bit of you that hurts as a DM. But yeah, so I'd like to start out with talking about his particular situation. That he had sent a brilliant email to me, really nicely detailed. I'm going to summarize that, Jason. I do apologize. And then after that, I'd like to kind of go into some of the some ways on how to deal with this and how it could have been handled better, at least in my opinion, and also some of the origins of where some of the concepts that he's using to make the ruling come from. If you've been playing D&D for a while, the spells have changed over time, and there are some things that have gone from the rules that used to be there that set up a certain paradigm for the spells, a certain, I guess you could say, precedent. But we'll go over that in a moment. So let me begin with the scenario. So in this scenario, there is, the party's going through the dungeon. They split up to investigate a couple of rooms, and the dwarf player comes upon a small room, a 6x6 room, no doors, no windows, other than the doorway that he comes through. He enters through. In the center of the room are a group of skeletons. He checks for advantage, and the DM indicates that he does have advantage. The skeletons haven't noticed him, so he decides that he is going to use Thunderwave to try and obliterate the skeletons. So at this time, the DM asks him if he's going to use it at full power, and one of the notes in the email indicated that Jason, in his campaign, allows spellcasters to cast their spells at less than full power if they want to. At this point, the player says yes, and so then Jason, the DM, says roll it, and he rolls it. He obliterates the skeletons, and after this, Jason asks him to roll it, make a dex check, and so he makes a the player, he doesn't understand what the question is coming from, so he assumes it's in regard to a hazard from the skeletons. It says, I'm okay with the dust. I'm sure I can take it. I'll take the damage. At which point, DM indicates no, it's to avoid the effects of the reverb from the thunder wave. The spell had an area of effect that exceeded the area of space, and so Jason, the DM, had decided that the thunder wave would then double back, kind of bounce off the walls and inflict damage. This is where the discussion begins between Jason and the player. And so the dwarf player is upset. It's not what it says in the spell. It doesn't say anything about a reverb. It's his spell. It doesn't affect him. And these are certainly logic. This is certainly logic and rationale I've heard before in dealing with spells in various games. There are various ways to look at magic, and in some cases, it is a situation where magic does not affect the source of the magic, or there are other ways to interpret it. So there, after that debate with the player was upset, and I guess according to the email, tore up his character sheet and left the game. Now, that's unfortunate, because really here, it sounds like it was a situation that didn't need to happen, and Jason tried to give some warning to his player in regard to the potential danger. So the scenario explained, I'm going to kind of go over some of Jason's rationale that he used as well. He discussed the physics, a shock wave, which is kind of what Thunderwave describes as the shock wave of force that pushes out. It does describe in the spell description that it'll push other objects and stuff. It's reasonable from a physics standpoint that it would then bounce off the walls and come back at you. I can agree with that from a physics standpoint. And then it goes on to support the argument by demonstrating other instances in which things that weren't explicitly stated in the rules were allowed to the benefit of the players. I guess an instance where an elf was able to ricochet arrows off of a tree to disable an orc so the rest of the party could go by. There's nothing in the rules well, I mean, I suppose you can find it, but I mean, there's nothing specifically stating that any kind of special tricks and stuff like that are given or are, and how to do them. But they're there. I mean, if you interpret the rules right. And I think the key to the issue here and the key to the argument is your interpretation. Two things: your interpretation of how physics and magic work together, and then also how you communicate this to the players, because ultimately, they have to have fair warning, fair knowledge of the risks involved in their actions. It should not be left to common sense always, because in the tabletop environment where you're trying to keep track of a lot of things and a lot of variables, and there's excitement and there's your character and there's role playing, and then there's trying to keep one step ahead. And I think there's still room for reminders. So that is the scenario, and so from this, I think really there, like I was saying, there's two things to determine. First, how you relate physics to your magic, and also, and so that there is for us, for longtime DMs, that's kind of a given, that magic spells in D&D sort of follow along, unless stated specifically otherwise, in some cases contrary to what you might think, with the physics involved in the material that they're producing. If you look at the text for Fireball, for example, going back to AD&D and in second edition, I mean, the text is almost identical. It's pretty much cut and paste. But not only does Fireball give an area of effect as a 20-foot sphere, but it also then goes in to discuss the fact that the Fireball will track through and expand to fill its original volume. So there is a reasonable expectation through that spell that the fire behaves like fire. Now, the spell there does specifically indicate that it doesn't have a lot of concussive force, and so anybody casting that spell could reasonably assume that they're not going to be able to use the force of the fireball to do anything, maybe more than blow out a candle or something like that. Why you'd be using a fireball to blow out a candle, I don't know, but hey, whatever. So that's one example. Another example would be Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt in the early versions, AD&D, second edition, it discussed how the lightning bolts would bounce off of non-conductive surfaces that they came in contact with before the maximum range of the spell. It even went so far as to talk about how to do controlled ricochets to kind of bank shot your lightning bolt if you wanted to. And you would run into situations back in those days where you'd fire a lightning bolt down a hallway, it would go through all of the creatures in the way, and if you misgauged the distance of the hall or you weren't really thinking about it, it would then bounce back and could potentially affect you as well. So those are two really good examples of how major spells used to discuss very clearly the aspects of the physics of those spells and how they could affect the gameplay. Now, that said, by 3 and 3.5, those particular elements of those spells are gone. They don't discuss, I think third edition and I believe third edition still talked about the 20-foot sphere for the fireball, and they even had a chart with tokens and stuff that showed that it would still follow, try to fill its original volume. So that part was there, but lightning bolt stops ricocheting. And by the time you get to 5th edition, now I don't have any information on 4th, so you'll have to leave me. I'll have to take anybody's word at that. I skipped 4th edition, but by 5th edition, neither of those two spells talks about anything beyond the basic effects of the spell. So if somebody is, and most of the spells in 5th edition seem to follow suit, very simple, very basic, straightforward rules that get the meat and potatoes of the spell effect, the essentials out of the way, but don't talk about other interpretations, especially the physics of the spells. Thunderwave does talk about a wall of force going out, but but in the same way that a lightning bolt is a bolt of lightning and a fireball is a ball of fire. These are things that are both used as descriptors for the effect, but they don't say specifically how the physics of those work. Certainly, Thunderwave is a little bit more specific as far as what kind of force it can exert, but Thunderwave does not talk about any repercussions. So that's how, I think where the idea of spells having unintended effects and repercussions come from is from the older DMs who probably learned it that way from the DMs that came before them and have passed it down and played it all along, just assuming that through that tribal knowledge of from DM to DM that it was just how it was in the newer edition. So there's your precedent where that then comes into how you're going to interpret the physics in your game. So if you choose to, and this also comes down to a bit of a disclosure, it's the next two parts are really two halves of the same part. So if you're going to have your magic follow physics, first of all, you have to decide that up front, and everybody has to understand that from the start of the game. It's really, I think, in my opinion, worth noting that in this game, magic follows physics. Magic creates a physical effect, and the physics of that effect will reign true. If you're not going to do that, and magic is magic and physics is physics, that's also worth covering up front. But in either case, there's no accounting for every instance and every possibility within your game. So it does come down to something that has to be clarified in the moment. Again, going back to what I was saying before, D&D is very dynamic. Role-playing in general is very dynamic, and sometimes it's all of the repercussions, the basic repercussions of an action aren't going to relate to you because you're too busy worrying about turn order, spell casting time, DC, all of these things that you have to calculate in the moment. So going back to the example here, when Jason tells the dwarf's player, do you want to use that at full effect? In the back of Jason's mind, I'm sure it makes perfect sense what he's asking. He's asking, do you want to use this at full effect? Because there is the possibility of it being more than you need, and that could hurt you. No judgment here or anything, but where I believe that there is room for improvement in that declaration is Jason needs to make sure that the player understands those repercussions. Any DM, a DM really needs to understand make sure the players understand the repercussions of the actions. In that situation, simply saying, even you don't have to lay it down on the table, but you could go ahead and simply say something along the lines of, "Hey, just remember, if it's too powerful, that's going to bounce back on you," or something like that. And it's reasonable to assume that a spellcaster who has learned his spells and practiced them is going to be aware of those potential repercussions, those potential hazards involved in his spell. With Thunderwave, there are other things. Continuing with Thunderwave. With Thunderwave, there are other things that you could take into consideration as a DM and in a situation. Maybe the ground is shaky. Maybe you're fighting on the edge of a glacier, and Thunderwave could, cause an avalanche. It could cause a cave-in. Thunderwave could, cause secondary explosions if there were sensitive items in the room. Is there a gas spore that it's gonna trigger and cause to explode? These are other things that are not explicitly stated in the ruling for Thunderwave, but if you're going to play it from a physics standpoint, you definitely want to be aware of. And so, I think a spellcaster would realize through his years of practice, or his months of practice, however long you want to assume that he's going to learn the magic, that he knows what it's going to do. So again, kind of upfront, and this carries through with a lot of things. I think anytime the player is going to assume some risk, as a DM, it's worth noting for a moment, or taking a moment just to go, okay, are you sure you want to do that? At least give an indication of caution. make sure it's clearly a cautionary note and not something that just asks for them to fill in a variable. How high do you want to dial the spell? Certainly, to you as a DM, may be very clear, but is that going to be clear to the player? So going on from there is then, if you're not going to use magic with physics, this is something that also needs to be clear, because at that point, first of all, magic that without physics becomes a little bit more high fantasy and a little easier to abuse. If you don't have to worry about the reverb from a thunder wave or catching yourself in your own fireball or bounce back from a lightning bolt, these things become a little easier to just throw around, and the casters in the party will be a little more free. Now, you may want that, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's also good to establish up front. You also need to be clear where heroic action, rule of cool, all of these things factor in. There's nothing to say that in a moment, even if it hadn't been established ahead of time, that a player can sit there and say, okay, I want to cast Thunderwave into that enclosed area. I want to try and inflict damage twice on those skeletons or those monsters. I want to get them once when the Thunderwave goes out, and when it comes back in, I want to try and catch them in a second, set of damage. Now, in a situation like that, on the reverb, I would definitely downplay the damage and make sure that it is lesser from the original damage, because it is an echo, and an echoed sound is generally not going to be, especially if it's not a controlled echo, is not going to be anywhere focused or as powerful as that original force. And Thunderwave really doesn't say it's sound; it just says it's a wall of force. It could be magical force, for that matter. Thunderwave is just the name of it. So when you're dealing with non-physics and rule of cool, consistency is going to be important. And really, I think the biggest failing, and for lack of a better term, failing in this particular scenario, is that the player quit because he was blindsided. I feel he didn't have. I feel, and again, this is just my commentary, but I feel that player didn't have a reasonable understanding of the risk involved in his action, and when he was confronted by it, it seemed unfair. The rules didn't state specifically that there was a risk to him. He understood magic to work in a certain way, which sounds like it was very much more of a high fantasy sort of a situation where I am immune to my own magic. I don't have to worry about it. I am the ultimate controller of my magic. And that is a fair thing to believe as a spellcaster, because there are many traditions of cinematic and literary magic and all of that, and even real magic, philosophies throughout history, where really you are unharmed by your own stuff. But it needs to be said. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Really, in the end, it's a matter of communication. So whether you're going to use physics and magic hand in hand, magic creates a physical effect. After the effect is created, it is bound by physical law. Or whether it's high fantasy or loose kind of cinematic magic, where it's magic and it works just the way it says in the rules. You don't have to worry about it. This needs to be communicated clearly and upfront. And in any situation where you are not dealing with something clearly defined in the rules, as a DM, it's worth mentioning the risk to your players. And also, if as a player, it's worth being aware, honestly, where your DM can bite you. Not all DMs are jerks, and certainly most of them are not. There are some that are. But even a good DM has got to challenge you. And part of the challenge is risk. And so if you are setting your character up to face a risk, and the DM is seeing this as an opportunity to take advantage of that risk, not in a cruel or heartless way, but in a cinematic or adventuresome way, he's looking for that. You have to be watching for it as well. But as the DM, it is your table. It's everybody's table, but it's you're the guide. And the onus is on you to make sure that everybody understands. So, in the case of Jason's example that he sent in here, he wasn't being a bad DM. He maybe just wasn't communicating as well as he could. I tend to like to work with physics in my magic when I run games, because for me, I've already got enough to worry about without having to remember that magic fire doesn't work the same as real fire unless it states there in the text. Having that default of the world as we know it sans magic is certainly a great way to start, and it takes some of the burden off of off of you during those minute calculations, those last minute calculations that you're trying to do in your brain while you're trying to run everything. So I do run that way, but I also like to make sure that people are warned when there's an action that's going to cause them some sort of feedback or kickback. But really, I think that pretty much covers physics and magic and how this can be a bad or a good thing in a campaign depending on how it's run. I got my cat trying to photobomb me back there, but it doesn't have to be a ruinous event in a game. Also, I mean, kind of one little follow up here. In a situation where you have where a player feels that they were caught off guard or they were treated unfairly by a ruling that you made, and as a DM, it's certainly your prerogative to rule on the game. It's what we have to do all the time. It is worth taking a moment to make sure that they understand it, and also if they truly seem blindsided, it's not hurting you as a DM or your game to reconsider and show them a little lenience in the moment and say, okay, I made a mistake. I did not clarify that up front. Let's back up a minute. Would you like to handle that differently? Now, you don't want to do that too often because you certainly want the players to feel that there are consequences to their actions. But early on, before it's established or when you're first establishing your table rules, it's not bad to do that once in a while. If somebody's going to do something truly dumb, and dumb in the sense of that it's just not the best action to do, take a moment and make sure that they understand what it is that's happening. They may not have thought about the fact that there is a rule that says what they're about to do is dangerous. We see in movies and stuff heroes that fall from high heights and they jump down and they do all sorts of crazy stuff that just defies reality. And so that leap that the player may have seen somebody do in a movie may be something that's going to cause them damage under the following rules. Again, make sure that you're clear when they're about to do something that might harm their character until you feel that everybody's up to speed. So, kind of in brief, decide whether or not physics and magic go hand in hand or if they're separate things. Be clear about it up front. Communicate to your players when there is an instance where there is perhaps a lack of understanding or awareness on the part of the player that what is going on. Make sure when you do state those dangers that you are clear about it, and then also be willing to discuss them when it becomes clear that there was a moment where the two of you just weren't communicating at the same level and there was still a misunderstanding. Nobody should ever feel like the only option is to walk away from the table angry and just quit the game. There's no reason for that. I mean, there's going to be somebody who does that, and if they're really that kind of a person, they probably are in the wrong hobby, but that's going to be the minority and not the majority of your players. Most of your players that do rash things like that truly feel like they've been blindsided and treated unfairly. But yeah, so that was what I wanted to talk about today. Elf Bait is growing, and certainly we're up to, I think it's only like 16 subscribers. But hey, it's a small channel. It's me in my garage and my cat, and it's. I want this to be a thing, so certainly share it with your friends. Let them know what's going on. I would love to hear questions and comments from folks, so by all means, go ahead and put them down below in the comment section, and I'll answer them. It's one of those situations where this should become a resource for folks to share ideas. And yes, I'm talking at you or to you, but certainly you have a provision to communicate to me. And I'd be happy to answer those questions. If there are things you'd like to hear me talk about, for example, this whole video was spawned on by Jason's email to me, feel free to communicate it in the comments. Or, if you know me through another means, go ahead and email me. I'll actually post contact information down below as well. But thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and go out and adventure. Have a good one.